On today's episode, we speak with industrial psychologist Dr. Stanley Fallaw about the characteristics that predict an individual's propensity to build wealth, why physicians have a bad reputation in this department, and what we can do to improve. Dr. Fallaw is the author of The Next Millionaire Next Door and the founder of DataPoints, a research and technology company that provides advisors and individuals with behavioral science tools to achieve financial success. DataPoints created the industry's first assessment of an individual's propensity to build wealth based on the millionaire next door. Dr. Fallaw received her Ph.D. in applied psychology from the University of Georgia. We dive into the 6 behavioral components that contribute to an individual's propensity to build wealth. And these are social indifference, frugality, an internal locus of control, confidence and financial literacy, conscientiousness, and planning and monitoring. We discuss how a few big decisions can have far-reaching consequences on our ability to build wealth, like choosing a neighborhood, choosing a spouse, and taking the time to create a long-term comprehensive financial plan. She gives us some smaller habits to help us develop our wealth-building potential, like suggestions for apps that allow us to check in on our finances easily, reading blogs and books to allow us to realize how much control we really do have, and how much success others have had. And we end with how she's passing that wealth-building mindset on to her children.
Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring, a practical guide for practicing physicians. Dr. Bradley Block interviews experts in and out of medicine to find out everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. The ideas expressed on this podcast are those of the interviewer and interviewee and do not represent those of their respective employers. And now, here's Dr. Bradley Block.
Dr. Stanley Fallaw, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So everyone wants to be wealthy, just like everyone wants to be popular, loved, fit, attractive. Some of these things we're born with, like a trust, but according to you and your father's research, much more often than not, it's really hard work and discipline that gets you to wealth, not inheritance. Now, physicians certainly don't lack for grit and discipline, but when it comes to wealth accumulation, we're really the butts of jokes. So why do you think it is that physicians are such under-accumulators of wealth, to use your terminology?
I think that there are a couple of different reasons for that, and you're right that the discipline and the perseverance that's required to get through medical school and residency and all of that are very clear. I think that there are a couple of different reasons. One in particular that we've been beginning to research, and we've seen this before in terms of how our life experiences start out and kind of what we think of when we think of a physician, has sort of an impact on what we end up spending if we don't have anybody guiding us, right? So if I think that becoming a doctor and means and equals having a huge house and a big car or lots of cars, let's say, that might be sort of the schema, if you will, kind of a psychological map of what it looks like to be a doctor. And so when you become a doctor and you don't maybe have a lot of experience managing your personal finances, you end up spending to sort of achieve what you think it means to be a doctor. So I think that that's one reason. And then again, I think that like any professional, a lot of physicians are very much focused on their work, on the work that they do. And because of the high income, I think that they often mistakenly think, well, that's going to sort of take care of the finances, right? There's not much more I need to do. But thankfully, there are folks like you and others that are sharing that, hey, that's not it. That income isn't the only thing that you need to be worrying about. And so I think that that's changing over time.
Yeah, I was just in the operating room with an anesthesiologist and was chatting with him about this topic. And he said, I have a guy. Okay, well, what is that guy doing for you? He manages my money. He makes sure that I'm doing the right thing. Well, what does that mean? Like, what tasks is he accomplishing? What's your plan? How much are you saving? Like, how is it invested? And he didn't know, because he's focused on just being the best anesthesiologist he can be, and he just inherently trusts someone else to do that. And I personally think that comes from also the fact that in our business, we don't necessarily need to understand finance. So if you had a doctor who's maybe running his own practice, that one is going to have his finger on her finger on the pulse of what's going on. But if you're an employee, this is not where our expertise is. And a lot of other people that end up becoming wealthy do so because they're in industries that at least touch a little bit upon that. So if you have like artists or athletes, right, these are also people who are notorious for not managing their money well because it's not what it takes to be a good athlete or artist. So I think we kind of end up in that area, one, because of what society expects us, and we're going to get to that because that's one of social indifference, one of your 6 characteristics of what it really takes to accumulate wealth. But I think also just because we don't know, we didn't need to know. And like you said,
Right.
we're focused on our area of expertise.
Yep, absolutely. I think going back to something you said about I have a guy who's managing it, right? Or a gal, let's say, too. I think that traditionally financial services institutions and organizations that were really focused on selling financial services, so receiving commissions and things like that. So not necessarily not necessarily doing what's in the best interest of their client, but instead selling products that were suitable, to use a technical term. I think that for a long time, those organizations really focused on those high income earners, and certainly physicians fall into that. So there's also sort of market forces, right, working against folks, and certainly trying to sell investments and sell certain investment products that aren't necessarily, perhaps in the best interest. And like you said, there's a lot of focus on investing and maybe a little less focus on the planning and budgeting and all of that good stuff, which isn't as exciting maybe as the investing side.
Yeah, I feel like a financial advisor who's telling you to stop spending, don't buy that fancy car, don't buy that big house. That's what you need to hear. Then the financial advisor learns what it feels like to be a doctor, right? Because in our job, it's our job to tell people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. The marketing industry that tells you to, take this supplement and you'll be skinny or whatever, their job is to tell you what you want to hear. Our job is to tell you what you need to hear. But it sounds like that financial advisor that takes on the individual to that degree really is giving advice that the person may not want to hear, and that might actually turn them away from that advisor.
Right. I think that, again, money is very emotional, and our lifestyle and kind of how we live our life, and having someone come in and tell us, hey, you might want to think about doing things differently. That can be a real challenge, like you said, whether it's in the healthcare field or in the financial services field. So you're right that some of us don't want to hear that message. It's hard to get that message across. But I think, again, particularly when it comes to money management, your finances depend on hearing those, maybe, and sometimes criticisms, if you will, and other ways of managing your financial life.
And this is what your company does, right? You help to determine where those maybe personality characteristics or personality traits that the individual, where they're stronger and where they're weaker, what the financial advisor needs to help them to focus on and help them to manage a bit better. Whereas if they're stronger in another characteristic, and we're going to get to these later, they don't necessarily need to pay as much attention to. So it's almost as if you're diagnosing their weak points for accumulating wealth.
Right. Yep. And so, when we think about sort of all of the different characteristics that we have that make us who we are, this is sort of the field of personality and individual differences. At DataPoints, our company, we use psychometrics, which is a way of measuring those characteristics to help people identify, where they may be tripped up when it comes to managing their financial life. So in addition to the things like, again, that we'll probably talk about related to wealth building, we measure things like even being open to having conversations about lifestyle. Some of us just don't want to hear that, and will really struggle with that kind of feedback. But that could be what's sort of holding us back from really achieving our financial goals. So, our focus is on, like you said, the diagnosis, but really looking at the psychology of individuals and clients.
I think your message is going to be easier for physicians to hear because a lot of the people in the personal finance space, they end up sounding like a salesperson. But hearing you sound like a scientist. So it's just going to be easier for us to palate something coming, I think, from you than it will be from other people in the finance industry. Because it just it sounds like it makes sense, and it sounds like it's coming from a STEM background. You're one of our people.
Right. Yep. No, I certainly don't, have an MD. There are, psychiatrists and things like that have that degree. But, absolutely, we're focused on making sure that we're actually measuring scientifically what we say we're measuring. Even if we're talking about something like risk tolerance, which there's a lot of talk, or rather, there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to understand your tolerance for taking certain risks when you're investing. You really have to make sure that you're measuring that in an accurate, valid, and reliable way. So that's really what we focus on at DataPoints.
Especially since at the time of this recording, the Dow dropped 800 points yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to, it's anticipating what we're going to do in the future is really helpful as well, because again, several weeks ago or months ago, things are looking great. It's when things get rough that it's important to understand what your propensities are. Are you someone that's going to just constantly be watching CNBC to see what's happening all day long? And wanting to, kind of hit the sell button at the moment something starts dropping or the market starts dropping? Or can you, be comfortable and confident during those times? And so understanding that about yourself can ultimately help you become more financially successful.
And I think that's a situation where that anesthesiologist is going to be in better shape because he's just going to be putting his head in the sand and letting someone else manage that. So he's not even going to, CNBC is probably not even on his radar.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that if his advisor is doing the right thing during those times, then that could make sense. But if he's paying a huge commission for the changes that he's making to his portfolio, then that's going to be a problem.
So in a previous podcast, we talked about the science behind habit development. And as it turns out, smaller habits are much more likely to stick. So if you tell someone to floss between just 2 teeth once a day, at the end of the year, they're much more likely to still be flossing than someone who you tell to floss their whole mouth. Or when it comes to exercise, if you want to start exercising, the goal should just be 1 push-up a day, not start working out for an hour every other day. Because then at the end of the year, that second person is not likely going to be exercising anymore. And then they're actually going to even feel bad about themselves for not exercising.
Right.
So the big decisions take significant willpower, but human beings aren't that high in the willpower department for a period of time. But the smaller decisions don't take quite as much, and you can build small habits like the 1 push-up a day. So
right.
I want to get to the small habits later, but like if you can just have 1 good workout, 1 really hard, really good workout that takes care of a lot of your financial problems for a year to come, I think that's tantamount to what you say about choosing your house and choosing your neighborhood. So let's talk about the ramifications of where you decide to live and what house you decide to buy in how it affects your financial life down the road, not just in the cost of the house itself.
Yeah. So, I think that, again, this goes back to the psychology of how we sort of interact with one another and how we're influenced by one another. Obviously there's a whole field, social psychology studies sort of our interactions. And one of the fields that is sort of related to that is sociometrics, looking at how we relate and compare ourselves to one another. So it happens, of course, from a psychological perspective, especially if you're someone that maybe isn't as financially confident, doesn't have a lot of education about what it takes to build wealth, and someone that's sort of open to being influenced by others. If you choose a house that is, again, perhaps a little more than you can afford right now, that comes with a whole host of other things that you're going to be responsible for as someone that's in that community. You're going to feel the influence of what other people are driving. Again, if you're confident, you don't have to worry about those kinds of things, then that's okay. But again, it really does influence a lot of spending in a lot of other categories once you've purchased a house in a certain neighborhood. So, my father talked about this quite a bit, certainly studied it quite a bit, that a lot of these millionaire next door types are found in neighborhoods where you wouldn't imagine them to be. You wouldn't, again, they've got a $300,000 house, but yet they're worth, $2 million. It doesn't seem to make sense. But when you think about it from a scientific perspective, it makes sense because, again, they're not as influenced perhaps as their peers. into purchasing everything else that goes along with that house. That goes, the other piece that's important there is that a lot of us think, well, I'll keep moving around. I'll move to another neighborhood. Maybe I'll downsize. Well, even the moving has costs associated with it, right? So I think it's one of those things that, the first choice can really put you on a trajectory. And so you have to think about that pretty seriously as you consider where you're going to live.
And even if you think you can avoid the social pressure, it's inevitably going to creep its way into like I live on Long Island. So that is a place that is a hot box of social pressure where, the car that you drive, the camp that you send your kids to.
Oh yeah.
It's what SAT, my kids aren't nearly old enough for this type of stuff, but like what SAT tutor you're sending them to, right? All of that stuff gets into keeping up with the Joneses, and all that stuff costs money. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so all of it has ramifications. So aside from buying your house and buying your neighborhood or deciding on the neighborhood, are there any other big decisions, big one-time decisions, or maybe a few times in a lifetime that are going to have a big impact on you afterwards, like your car, or I'm not sure it should come into the decision making, but your spouse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was the one I was going to mention. When you think about being influenced by someone, right? That's someone that's constantly with you and in your house and shares, should be sharing in the sort of financial success of the household. So, spouse is something that, who you decide to share your life with. And this goes for friends as well, because you can think about friends in terms of the kinds of activities that you might be involved in. But certainly spouse, we have seen consistently that individuals, particularly business owners who have a spouse really able to manage the household finances like a business, tend to be really successful. They have a budget. They know how much they're spending every week or every month. They're frugal. They're not extravagant. They're really focused on building wealth over time. And even when they've built that wealth, they tend to be pretty consistent in their spending. That is to say, even when they've made it, so to speak, they're not out there, vacationing everywhere and so forth. So, I think that's one that we don't think about. I think going back to what we talked about before, where you sort of had this idea in your head as you go through school, for example, of what it is to be a doctor, or a physician, I should say. It's also the case that your spouse also has an idea in his or her head of what it's like to be the husband or wife of a physician. And so it's important early on to really understand and set some expectations about what that means. My husband is an attorney. He was an attorney at a big firm here in Atlanta for a long time. And thankfully we didn't see, I didn't see a lot of this and didn't feel a lot of it, but there's a certain lifestyle that goes along with that sort of career. And you can kind of get swept into it if you're not careful. And so I think it's important to kind of recognize that in ourselves and have our spouses recognize that as well.
I wonder if that makes it into popular culture at all. I don't watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, but I wonder when they're sitting down with each other, if they're asking the contestants, so how is your 401k looking? Do you consider yourself a prodigious accumulator of wealth? I wonder if those types of questions are making it onto the show.
Yeah, that's funny. I don't think that they probably are. I mean, I think that what would be, some of the things that they could ask that wouldn't be so maybe a little less invasive might be something like, well, what does money mean to you? Does it mean that you can have everything you want, or does it just mean that you're secure financially? Like what's kind of the value that you have or that you place on finances, or what's the value that you place on, education and things like that, big ticket items that are going to come up in the future, and kind of where your future spouse, if you're not married yet, is thinking in terms of finance.
Although if they're on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, I think the answer to that is pretty clear.
Yeah, that's true.
I want to spend everything.
Yep. Oh, yep.
Okay, so that gets us to the 6 characteristics of prodigious accumulators of wealth, and I'm a fan of Carol Dweck, who wrote the book Mindset, and so her whole premise is that characteristics aren't static; you can work on them. So if you're someone who doesn't like to be the life of the party, you can actually change that about yourself slowly over time in how you think about yourself. and through practice.
Hmm.
So I think we can actually work on these characteristics. So I'd like to get into what these characteristics are, and maybe some, getting back to the idea of small habits, some suggestions that you might have for small habits that can help us to improve in these areas. So the first, is there any one in particular that you'd like to start with?
Yeah, any of them is fine. I think that the one that we just talked about is the frugal piece, right? Being frugal set of characteristics is one that absolutely can change over time. We talk about it when we measure it in terms of really being diligent when it comes to our finances and sort of having a value set that says, hey, I don't need the most extravagant thing. I need the thing that works, that's going to work for whatever it is I'm buying it for. And so I think that is one that can change over time. That's a tough one because it does have sort of this values and attitudes, and again, a lot of personality components to it as well. But I think that that's one, again, that we've seen over time, whether we're talking about the business owners back in the 80s and 90s that my father studied, or folks that are trying to achieve financial independence and retire early and those kinds of things today, that frugality is certainly one of those that really is, as we call it, an enduring characteristic of building wealth.
But is there anything in particular that you think for someone who isn't frugal or doesn't think they're frugal? And I think sometimes it's the opposite, right? People that don't think they're frugal are frugal, and people who think
the
they are
Dunning-Kruger.
actually are.
Yep.
Yeah. So, the Dunning-Kruger in medicine.
Yep.
Oh.
Yes.
So are there any small behaviors that you think could start us down the path to frugality? Like, should we be clipping coupons, or not shopping at the most expensive grocery store, or just, little things that probably won't tip the scales very much, but at least will get the behaviors moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things before we get to kind of the specifics there. I think that one of the ways to begin sort of thinking differently about being frugal is to read some examples of individuals that have built wealth on their own by being frugal. For a lot of us, we're not exposed to people that are frugal, particularly, again, if you're someone that maybe grew up in an affluent area and then, today has colleagues that are affluent and so forth. It's starting to understand that there is a different kind of way of living and a way of managing your life. So I'd say that's probably the first one, and that can come from reading blogs, for example. Again, there's a lot of folks out there that write about this now, thankfully. So that's one of them for sure. I think that the other one is simply, again, it's going back to goal setting and sort of habit formation. So you've got to know where you're headed. I don't think you can just sort of become more frugal if there isn't sort of an overarching goal about why you're going to make that change. So, that's not a very concrete set of suggestions there, but those are the two things to think about. Again, understanding that people have done this before and that you can do it as well. And then also having, really clear overarching goals for why you want to, adapt more of a frugal lifestyle.
Well, I think that gets us to planning, right? And actually, just to summarize those characteristics that we're going to get to: confidence, frugality, responsibility, social indifference, conscientiousness, and planning. And planning, I think that's an area really ripe for habit development. So if you need a reason to be frugal, and you find your reason, what you're saying is you find your reason to be frugal by making a plan. And so laying out how much money you need to save over X period of time in order to get to whatever your financial goal is. And this is where the financial advisor comes in, right? In figuring out what these numbers are.
Right. And certainly they can do these themselves as well. I think that that's something, an advisor can help, or if they have the time and want and have the interest, they certainly can do it as well. The planning component, we actually characterize, or it's kind of broader than that. So it's planning and monitoring. So when we think about the person with their head in the sand, it's also kind of getting out of the sand and saying, okay, once a week or once a month, I'm going to actually, check in on how things are going. And again, that can either be something that you've set up yourself, whether you're using like YNAB or something like that, or that
whether you're using what?
Like YNAB, you need a budget.
What is that?
If you've ever seen that, it's an app that you can use to do some financial planning, self-directed kind of financial planning and or Mint, whatever it might be that you use that you want to check in on, it's definitely part of this planning component. So it's not only setting goals and taking the time to plan out your week, but then, or your month or your year, but it's also being aware of what's going on in your financial life as well.
So I would imagine these apps make it easy to check in on that stuff. So, when we get into what we were saying earlier, that big workout, right? The biggest workout is choosing your neighborhood. You got to have a lot of self-control when you're choosing that neighborhood, and don't splurge on what you think of as the big doctor house. But another one is just getting one of these apps and setting it up such that checking in can be that small habit. So checking in once a month to see how everything's going on Mint or YNAB is going to be you can even have a reminder once a month. I think the more automated, the better. So something pops up on your phone, says check Mint today, and then you check it and you see how everything's going.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Would you say that's the minimum effective dose for planning, or is there anything else that you would recommend for planning and maybe for automation?
Yeah, again, I'm an industrial psychologist, so I'm not a financial planner, and that's not my area of expertise. We measure those characteristics in individuals. So I would say, from what we know, it's having, again, some set of goals, having some time to monitor, and those that do those things consistently and more often than others tend to be those that accumulate wealth faster.
All right. Well, earlier we talked about social indifference as well. I don't know if we really need to dive into that any further, because as we covered, this is where doctors fail, right? We see what our colleagues are buying. Maybe they're in a specialty that makes a lot more money, but we don't care. We went to medical school and did residency too. So we want to drive the Range Rover or the Jaguar. Or maybe it's our parents' expectations or our spouses. But this is where we fail. So we already talked about the neighborhood. Any other tips to cultivating social indifference such that we can really ignore those outside influences?
Well, what I think we should give doctors a little bit of a pass here, because one of the things that we know is that social indifference also has a negative side, right? So it makes us a little less concerned about the welfare of others. It is tied to that, even though it's not exactly the same thing. So I think that naturally most physicians are concerned about others. That's one of the reasons you probably went into the field. And so here, though, we're talking about its influence, obviously, on our finances. So, I think that, again, the tips are to have, certainly start setting goals and recognize that the desire to sort of, again, compete with one another socially or through what we buy isn't conducive to a financial goal that you've set. And that's how you, again, begin to sort of change that mindset, if you will.
I think personally, at least, since I discovered the FIRE movement, it's helped me to dial back on competing or keeping up with the Joneses. They have their own method of keeping up with the Joneses, though. They kind of compete for who can drive the crappiest car the longest,
right? Yeah,
so that they can stay in. So there's still that social influence there, but I think you can cultivate who you surround yourself with, at least in the virtual world,
right,
in order to help you. Actually, for myself, listening to podcasts before starting my own, I thought, I don't know these other podcasts, although some of them I do, but previously I didn't. Yet I associated them with my, I guess, electronic social circle, and I wouldn't have started this had I not been exposed to that. So I think you can, even if you're in one neighborhood, you can alter those social influences based on who you're interacting with in the virtual world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the pieces that was very different, again, from when my father started studying this to today, is the fact that you've got this influence literally in your pocket all day long, where you can see what everybody's doing. And so it makes it even more challenging to ignore what everybody's doing. But one of the researchers that I think is awesome is Cal Newport, who his book, Deep Work, talks about, again, you're not, if you have all these distractions, and it certainly is a distraction, it's also keeping you from doing your best work. So there's, several reasons why, you don't want to continuously have this influence of other people within your life.
Yeah, he talks about the flow state, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think the best example of that, just so for people who aren't familiar with his work, the best example of that in our world would be someone who's in the middle of the operating room, and let's say they're a cardiothoracic surgeon and they're doing a quadruple bypass, and 5 hours have passed, and yet to them it feels like no time has passed at all because
Yeah.
they're just
Yep.
so engrossed in what they're doing.
Yep.
High
Absolutely.
skill work like that.
Absolutely. Yep.
But his whole idea is you can't get to that high skill work
Yep.
with all those social distractions. So the
Yep.
new commodity is not going to be intelligence; it's going to be attention, your ability
Absolutely.
to
Yep.
focus.
Yep.
So the ability to ignore or rather to have social indifference.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you mentioned a little while ago that you're an industrial psychiatrist. So I just want to segue just for a moment into something, because one of the characteristics that you talk about is conscientiousness, and I've heard you discuss that as a predictor of success for employees. So just a brief interlude into a different topic before we talk about it for wealth accumulation. Since it's so important for those of us who hire employees, how do we test, or how do we figure out who's conscientious? It's just such a critical piece of hiring.
Yeah, so that was my field before I started focusing on sort of the wealth accumulation side, which again kind of was our quote unquote family business. But spent several years creating assessments to help and organizations hire leaders or individuals, and really the first step to determining how and what characteristics you want to hire for begins with really understanding the job. And so when you kind of look at what it takes to be successful in most jobs, it tends to be conscientiousness, one of the best predictors of future job performance. And there are a lot of different ways to measure it. Certainly, you could do that through using interviews, structured interview questions. There are several different employee selection assessments out there that you can use that can help you measure conscientiousness. But again, as an industrial psychologist, you have to remember that it really goes back to the specific job. And so while there are a lot of ways that you can measure different characteristics and use that to hire folks, there's also legal implications for using some of those tools. So as a legal disclaimer, I'll put that out there, that even though conscientiousness is one of the best predictors, it's still important to really understand what it takes to be successful in a specific role. So if you're hiring a receptionist, for example, there are a lot of different characteristics that you would want to look for, and conscientiousness is one of those.
Okay, well, I don't know how much that simplified it for the hiring and for the hiring process, but definitely something to keep in mind. So,
Yeah, yep.
So how does that tie into wealth accumulation? Because it would seem to me conscientiousness is almost the opposite side of social indifference, or right? So if you're conscientious, I'm sure some of that motivation comes from caring what other people think of you. And so if you have the social indifference on lockdown, then it might affect your conscientiousness.
Yeah, they're a little bit different. So if you think about, there's a big five model of personality, right? And conscientiousness is one of those big five components. One of the other components is agreeableness. So how well we get along with others, whether we like to be around people, whether we're accommodating. And that's sort of where social indifference falls a little bit too. So it's kind of a combination of factors. So it really is something different. And when it comes to accumulating wealth, somebody that's conscientious is going to be pretty diligent. They plan, again, going back to the planning component, and they are careful. So they're not making mistakes. They're remembering to pay their bills on time, even things that are simple like that. And so that's where conscientiousness comes into play. Really, one of the factors that is again a predictor of future financial success is this, ability to kind of stick with a plan, again, pay your bills on time, things like that. And again, it's the same, those are the same kinds of characteristics that you would want in an employee, right? Somebody that shows up, that diligently does their work, that pays attention to detail, all of those kinds of things.
Any recommendations for how we can develop that in ourselves if we feel like it might be one of our weak points?
So I think with conscientiousness, again, it's a personality characteristic. Certainly it can change somewhat over time. But I think that going back to when you mentioned kind of the small pieces or small habits, really focusing on, again, a specific area, having a bigger goal can help. I think that some of the reminders that are available now that say, okay, it's time to check in on your, or pay your bills and things like that can help. This is one too where if you're not as conscientious as you would like, again, certainly having a spouse or a partner that takes on some more of the detail work or outsourcing that work can be useful as well. So I don't have a ton of recommendations on becoming more conscientious because it is more like a set of personality characteristics pulled together that are kind of challenging to improve on. But there are ways to sort of get around it as well.
Well, I think for someone to be motivated to develop any of these, it comes back to something else that you talk about, which is the locus of control or responsibility, right? And I think for some doctors, we feel like we're a leaf in the wind, right? We're at the whim of the medical industrial complex, and we're constantly being hounded by administrators, and we have no control. Whereas other physicians, maybe they're in a different position, and maybe it's just how they feel about their situation. They feel like if they weren't happy, they could quit. They were the ones who decided to become a doctor. This is the world that they live in. They can control what they can control, but they are still the captain of the ship. So how does that influence wealth accumulation?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research on this particular area. And again, it's more like a personality characteristic. So the idea that you can actually affect your environment and that your actions can actually have consequences, sort of having that mindset and behaving accordingly is related to net worth, independent of your age or your income. Again, if you kind of understand that there are certain things that you can do in your financial life that are going to have long-term positive outcomes, and you start understanding that, reading about it, becoming more confident. Again, all these things are somewhat related. You'll have a higher likelihood of building and accumulating wealth over time. If instead, you kind of view, like you said, things are just happening to me. I can't do anything about this. That sort of mindset is one that may keep you from accumulating wealth and reaching and achieving goals. And again, the way to sort of change that mindset to having one that really, again, focused on what you can do and how you can impact your financial success. I think this comes from building knowledge, from also, again, going back to reading and understanding how others have done this on their own. That can be really powerful as well. So I think that, again, understanding that what we do can affect our financial future is really critical.
Now, do you think it's a bit of the chicken or the egg? Meaning like you've accumulated X amount of wealth and therefore you have more of a locus of control because you feel like because you have accumulated enough wealth, you can leave X situation? Or do you feel like in order to become an accumulator of wealth, you need to have the locus of control? Because you said it's related to net worth.
Yeah, so it's having a more of a, hey, what I do matters sort of mindset is related to net worth regardless of age or income. So I don't know which, comes first, and I don't, it's not necessarily causal. We just know that it's related. So there's a correlation there. I would say there's probably a moderator, meaning, for example, somebody that's already accumulated quite a bit of wealth perhaps now believes that they can, impact their financial future. But if we're talking about individuals who haven't made it yet, right? So who maybe don't think that they've really achieved their financial goals, we know that having that mindset that, hey, I can impact things is one that will relate to net worth.
There's one more characteristic that we haven't touched on yet, or we did only briefly, and that's confidence. And I think this is a place where maybe small habits can be helpful. Being confident in volatile markets or and being confident in our ability to manage our financial ourselves. This is the one that's tied into financial literacy, correct?
Yeah, I think becoming confident and obviously there's a general, hey, am I a confident person to begin with? But when we're talking specifically about financial confidence, we've seen a tie between building your knowledge and becoming more confident. Some of that can certainly come with experience as well, but again, one of the ways to combat some of those bad decisions that we make, right, when we're talking about investing, for example, is simply to build your knowledge in that area. Not so much that you become overconfident, because as we all know, when we're overconfident, we start making mistakes. We don't do things the right way from an investing perspective and things like that. But it's really what we call an effective confident. I have knowledge, I have some experience, I have folks that I can call on or count on to help me if should I need that, some help with my finances, that kind of thing.
Are there any other specific resources aside from maybe listening to my past episodes about personal finance or hiring Ryan Inman, who is the fee-only financial advisor that introduced us, or maybe searching on a podcast site to find out, search Dr. Sarah Stanley Fallaw to find out what other podcasts she's been on, aside from those? Anything else that you would recommend to start dipping our toes, but particularly for someone who's new at this, who it seems extremely daunting?
Yeah, particularly when it comes to the investing side. If you're familiar with Daniel Crosby, he is another psychologist, but he really focuses primarily on investing. So he has a book that came out last year, in 2018, called The Behavioral Investor. And I think that particularly for your audience and for the folks listening, the way that he talks about kind of what our mindset is and investing related to, again, our psychology and behavioral economics as well, is a great resource and can really help you build your confidence by recognizing the kinds of mistakes that we might make as well. So that's one I would definitely point folks to.
So if we could get a little bit personal, if that's okay. I think your father's career a little bit mirrors how it works for physicians, right? He had considerable success with his writing career, particularly with The Millionaire Next Door. And with that, he had a jump in his income. And similar to how a resident, right, we do okay as residents, but then when you become an attending, your salary jumps considerably all at the same time. In contrast to other professions where, as your business gets slowly more successful, you get, it slowly changes over time. So how did he prevent himself to falling into the traps that he wrote about in the underaccumulators of wealth?
Well, I think that he did have, while certainly The Millionaire Next Door was extremely successful, and The Millionaire Mind as well. He was sort of building his, kind of career slowly. He was started out as a professor. Certainly that's not, while it's not the lowest paid salary, it's not, he wasn't a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and then began doing a lot of consulting work. So that work, and then subsequent publications, kind of changed the trajectory of his life, certainly.
But then, he was on Oprah, right?
He was on Oprah twice. Yep, that was pretty crazy. Absolutely. And so I think that again, he's not here to answer those questions, but I guess from being his daughter, I can share that kind of side of it. He just was never pretentious, so he never felt the need to demonstrate that success to other people. He knew that he was successful. There were a lot of external things telling him that he was as well. And he really just, never changed kind of how he did things. There were a few things that he may have bought as he became more successful that were a little different maybe than when he started out, certainly. But, again, he just, he was always had his sort of blue collar background and continued to sort of maintain that as he lived his life.
One of my concerns for myself is that I'm doing well, better than my parents did, who did better than their parents did. So I want to make sure that my kids remain grounded. So how did he instill these values in you, and then how are you now passing those values on to your children?
Well, I wouldn't say I don't certainly have all the characteristics that we talked about today, and he didn't either. So I guess, but what we do have is certainly the knowledge of what it takes to build wealth. I think that the kinds of things that he taught me included things like hard work, patience, that things take a time. Certainly his career wasn't successful overnight. And again, that you don't have to do what everybody else is doing. And certainly in many cases, what everybody else is doing is funded through debt. So I think that, he instilled those things, and we continue to do that in our family as well.
I think what you're saying is pointing out how some people spend their money is in order to show wealth or show status that they don't necessarily have. Like your dad, through his success being on Oprah twice, right? It wasn't him trying to show his status, but that ultimately accomplished that. And so he then didn't need to compensate in other ways by spending money that then would cut into his ability to continue to plan for the future.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say that necessarily. I mean, I think going back to your point about what we're teaching our kids is probably more relevant. I think that we live in a pretty affluent area with, outside of Atlanta, and, daily our children are coming home from high school or middle school sharing with us that, they feel, like they're being left out because they haven't had 5 iPhones and they don't have the latest one, things like that. So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having at home where you can say, hey, I don't know what else that family's spending on. That's just not what we're spending money on. But hey, we're saving and we have a different perspective. And here are the things that allows us to do, vacation or whatever.
You're not throwing the other family under the bus, is what you're saying.
No, and I think that's important too. It's not, you don't want to, because you don't know. We don't know what's happening. It could be that they have more money than you could ever imagine, and you don't know that. But, I think it's important just to share that that's not, part of what our family does. And if you can start that from an early age, that's really, really useful. So don't start off with the 200-person 3-year-old birthday parties. That can be really helpful so that they don't have that expectation, but helping them understand that, there's things that you have to save for. That takes time, which means we're not, going to have the latest iPhone and things like that.
Oh, those definitely happen here on Long Island. I enjoy going to those with, hiring a band, and it's like going to a wedding, but it's a 3-year-old's birthday party, and the 3-year-old's not going to even remember it. Yeah. Oh,
right.
Yeah. I think that's the money spent on a 3-year-old birthday is probably predictive of something.
Definitely. Yep.
So is there anything else, any other parting words that you'd like to help us prevent us from becoming our financial stereotypes?
Right. Yeah. I think just going back to what we talked about earlier, which is really starting to think about thinking about that stereotype, thinking about, taking the time out of your busy day, because I know that most of the folks listening are extremely busy, but finding some quiet time to really consider kind of what it is that you wanted for your life and what you imagined, and then think about whether or not that really fits with becoming financially successful for the long term. And sometimes that self-reflection can just kind of begin a cycle of changing your behaviors and habits.
Yeah, we actually had an anesthesiologist on the show a few episodes ago. He calls himself the physician philosopher, and he talks about the Kinder questions, George Kinder's 3 questions. Mm-hmm. Like if you had a certain amount of time left on this earth, how would you choose to spend that time? And that can then help you with that financial planning, make those decisions.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us. So I really appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me on.
That was Dr. Bradley Block at the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. He can be found at physiciansguidetodoctoring.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question for a previous guest or have an idea for a future episode, send a comment on the webpage. Also, please be sure to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next time on The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.
Today's guest is not an attorney, accountant, or financial advisor, and neither am I. This information should not be considered personalized financial advice, and we will not be held liable for the use of any information contained within this interview. It is your responsibility to verify anything you've heard using other trusted and reputable resources.